The 2025 legislative session has reached the official halfway point. Statehouse reporters are here with an update on the past 9 weeks and what may be ahead on this edition of Iowa Press.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa PBS Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
Elite Casino Resorts is rooted in Iowa. Elite's 1,600 employees are our company's greatest asset. A family-run business, Elite supports volunteerism, encourages promotions from within, and shares profits with our employees.
Across Iowa, hundreds of neighborhood banks strive to serve their communities, provide jobs, and help local businesses. Iowa banks are proud to back the life you build. Learn more at iowabankers.com.
For decades, Iowa Press has brought you political leaders and newsmakers from across Iowa and beyond, celebrating more than 50 years on statewide Iowa PBS. This is the Friday, March 14th edition of Iowa Press. Here is Kay Henderson.
The 2025 legislative session in Iowa began on January 13th. On January 14th, Governor Kim Reynolds laid out her agenda for lawmakers and presented a budget plan to them. Since then, legislators have been focused on policy bills rather than the budget, although there's been a little bit of budget discussion this past week. Covering all of those discussions and more are three reporters who are joining me here at the table today. Skylar Tallal is a reporter for the Sinclair television stations, 4 of them in Iowa. Stephen Gruber-Miller is a reporter for the Des Moines Register, and Erin Murphy is with the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. Okay, folks, just a general question to you. What is the biggest thing that's happened so far this legislative session? I'll begin with you, Erin.
The biggest thing is the number of bills that we
Big
saw.
Pile.
yeah, a huge pile of bills. It seemed anecdotally even busier than most sessions, so Stephen and I both worked on this and pestered the poor overworked folks at LSA and asked them, and there were 2,031 bills introduced ahead of the first funnel deadline that we just passed a couple weeks ago. To put that in context, that is more than the entire full year sessions in 4 of the last 6 years. So for the first half of this session, we've already surpassed previous years in the number of bills introduced. It was a relentless schedule for that first month or so of the session.
Skylar, what's your big takeaway so far?
Well, to me, Governor Kim Reynolds didn't introduce anything that's been super controversial. You know, normally we've seen the changes to Iowa's area education agencies in the past, or those education savings accounts, and obviously Democrats haven't been too on board with those proposals. But this year, you know, we've seen the cell phone bill, which would ban cell phones at Iowa school districts, things like that, the energy bill, the child care, health care, and then even money for cancer research. So nothing that, Democrats are too concerned about.
Stephen, what strikes you as the big thing of the year?
The big story is the one thing they've actually passed, which is a bill removing gender identity as a protected class in the Iowa Civil Rights Act. So there were rumblings for several weeks, rumors that this might be coming, and then Republicans acted very quickly and introduced the bill and had it on the governor's desk within a week.
So, Stephen, this is the only bill that has been signed into law so far. Tell us a little bit about it and what occurred.
Yeah. So Iowa's Civil Rights Act protects people from discrimination in housing, public accommodations, education, and other areas. And it protects people based on characteristics like race, sex, gender identity until this law passed. So this takes gender identity out of the law, and Republicans say there's other federal and court precedent protections for transgender people. But of course, Democrats are saying this is literally taking protections out of the law. You're allowing discrimination to happen. So it takes gender identity out of the Civil Rights Act. It also requires birth certificates to designate somebody's sex at birth. Currently, you can get your birth certificate changed if you transition in Iowa. That will no longer be the case. It will have to list your birth sex. And it makes a number of other changes to sort of definitions in state law for what is described as a man or a woman.
Erin, when this was unveiled, the Speaker of the House said they had to do this, and also the Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Stephen Holt, said they had to do this based on some looming court challenges.
To protect some laws that State House Republicans, as they put it, passed in recent years regarding bathrooms that transgender students can use in schools, prohibiting transgender girls from playing in girls' sports in the state. And they referenced a lawsuit that has arisen in, I believe it's Iowa City, where a transgender student is the lawsuit claims the gender identity protections that were in Iowa Civil Rights Act as
The legal basis for the lawsuit,
thank you. And so that was the example that they listed of why we need this bill to remove gender ID, so these other laws that we've passed in recent years will uphold in the court. It also bears noting, as was highlighted many times during the debate, that Iowa becomes the literal first state in the country to remove a protected class from its civil rights code.
Skylar, you covered this. There were a lot of people at the State House.
There were a ton, I think. I mean, I've only been here 4 years now, but it was probably the biggest protest I've covered, and there's been some, really big issues up there. There's just a lot of, concern and worry from the trans community. I even, talked to one, kind of back to your point about the definition changes. I talked to a trans man from Urbandale who said, under this bill, I'm not technically my child's father anymore, and I have been for the last 14 years. So just changing like little things like that as well.
Yeah, and big things. For these people, these are huge deals, right? There's people who are worried that their legal documents won't match, their gender and things like that. So there's definitely, there was a woman who said that, who came and testified and said her baby girl would be classified as intersex, and she doesn't know kind of how that will affect her documents going forward as that child gets older too.
And to Skylar's point, for those of us who are a little longer in the tooth, Kay, and I'm not looking at anybody in particular here at the table.
You're looking right at me, aren't you? Hello.
But she's absolutely right, and I had thought about that too, about the size of the crowds and the protests that we saw at the Capitol. And I can only think of two examples that even remotely compare to what we saw this year, and that was the abortion so-called fetal heartbeat bill, the special session in 23, and the collective bargaining bill changes way back to 2017, Kay. Only time I can remember crowds at the Capitol even remotely resembling what we saw earlier this year.
Moving on, school districts are required to develop a budget, have public hearings, and then certify it, but they don't yet know what the legislature is going to give them. Skylar, let's brief our viewers.
Yeah, so that per pupil funding, both chambers are still at odds with their proposals right now, and there's no timeline really on when it's going to get done and passed. The Senate and the governor, Senate Republicans and the governor are on the same page, proposing a 2% increase in that per pupil funding. House Republicans are proposing 2.25%. Then they also have a couple of extra little pieces like additional money for transportation, operational sharing, another one-time cash of $22.6 million that they've kind of said, will help with inflationary costs, those sorts of things. And then, of course, Democrats have, proposed a higher increase of that 5%.
So does anyone think there are negotiations happening?
I don't. It
was
sure
hard to
doesn't
tell.
feel like it.
It was hard to tell yesterday when Speaker of the House, Pat Grassley, was talking about it.
You never want to make a declarative statement without being sure, but yeah, there has not been movement on this for a few weeks now. Both the House and the Senate acted with relative urgency to get the bill out of their chamber by, they have actually a legal deadline of passing school funding within 30 days of the governor's budget presentation. Well, that was back on Valentine's Day. So they are well past that deadline now, but after passing it out of their own chamber, they have not come to that agreement between the chambers.
And what's sort of fascinating about it, from our seats is that Skylar laid out the numbers. They're not terribly far apart. I mean, we're talking about a pretty small number of millions of dollars, admittedly, but as a percentage of the bigger package and the budget as a whole, it's not a huge gap that they're trying to close. Skylar mentioned the extra little pieces the House introduced. I don't know if that's what's hanging it up, but it is kind of fascinating to see that this is sort of ground to a halt at the moment.
Well, and the other thing is that extra piece that the House has proposed could be done elsewhere. If they wanted to give schools that money, they could do it in another bill in another fashion as they move forward. Speaking of moving forward, the leaders of the House and Senate committees that deal with Ways and Means bills, Ways and Means means taxes, have recently proposed a property tax plan. What's in it?
All of our favorite topic to cover here. Super easy to understand and simple to explain, right? So
That's why we gave it to you.
Yep.
yeah, thanks, Erin. I was out of the room when that was decided. So a couple of years ago, as a backstory, Statehouse Republicans passed a property tax relief bill. Still hearing a lot about it on the campaign trail and from Iowa homeowners, so here they are again trying with another shot. Basically, this one does a few top-level things, uses some state funding to try and cover the property tax revenue that goes towards school districts, so to ease that burden at the local level, caps future property tax revenue growth by local communities, and phases out a rollback that was put in place that we have nowhere near enough time to explain fully. Look for all our stories online and you'll get more on that. They claim that it will save property tax payers $426 million over 5 years.
And most of that is the additional state share that will go toward local public school districts.
Right.
And by spending about $400 million a year on that, that will trickle down, and so schools will not be raising that in local property taxes or maybe even reducing local property taxes, as I sort of understand.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You went much better, more clearly than I did. So the bill has been floated, and now we're waiting to hear the Senator Dan Dawson and Representative Bobby Kaufman said we want this to sort of marinate for a week or two, let people learn it and get their feelings on it. And we haven't had a subcommittee hearing on it yet. That will obviously be interesting to see how local governments feel about it and tax interest groups feel about it, and we'll see whether that has a future this year.
One of the things that strikes me is that, you know, heading into this, people were sort of waiting to see if the governor might unveil a plan of her own on property taxes. When she gave her big speech in January, she did not weigh in on this. And she didn't weigh in a couple of years ago when they passed the previous iteration of a property tax relief plan, number one. Number two, Stephen, it always seems to me that if legislators are going to cut taxes, they like to do it in an election year. This is not an election year.
That's true. I'm sure this will not be the only time they talk about cutting taxes.
Okay.
But yeah, the chairs of the House and Senate Ways and Means Committees, Senator Dan Dawson and Representative Bobby Kaufman, I mean, they have been listening to people for the past 2 years about that previous property tax bill, and Senator Dawson told us that they've been having these conversations over that time period. They've been quite eager to kind of tackle this issue in the past. It's a complicated issue, so I think that they've been hearing from folks for a long time on it, and we will see if that listening process turns into positive reviews from those stakeholders.
Well, Stephen, you and I listened to the Revenue Estimating Conference meet this past week, and this was an important meeting in terms of setting the table for how much legislators can spend.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the state budget. I'll give you a couple of numbers. Let's see if we can follow them. They're not going to be too bad. The trend is that with the 3.8% flat tax that took effect this year, state revenues are dropping. They're going to drop by about $600 million. The panel expects Iowa to take in about $8.5 billion in the upcoming fiscal year.
Which starts July 1st.
Starts July 1st. That's $400 million less than they're spending this year. One more number. Next year, Governor Reynolds is proposing to spend $9.4 billion, and that's about a $900 million gap between what we're going to take in and what we're going to spend. So she wants to make up the difference, and Republican lawmakers want to make up the difference in that with the several $billion that are in the state's end-of-year budget surplus and the taxpayer relief fund.
It's $6.6 billion, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of money because
in those accounts.
Because the big picture is Republicans have been spending well under what the state has taken in for several years in preparation, essentially, to cut these taxes. And their idea, and the panel is expecting a rebound of revenues in the third year to start going back up. And so their idea is they'll use this savings to cushion for those few years until, in theory, tax revenues increase again.
And what we're hearing from Democrats is what we used to hear from Republicans, right?
Yeah, Democrats and Republicans have flipped their positions here. Democrats are saying Republicans always talk about not using one-time money to fund ongoing expenses like the state budget. But that's exactly what they're doing. And essentially, Speaker Grassley said yesterday, it's different if we have enough money saved up.
Let's turn our attention to some other policy issues that they're discussing. There are a couple of immigration-related bills, Skylar.
Yeah, and there have been a couple that have been introduced. Some are moving forward, some aren't. One of those would make local law enforcement comply with ICE, specifically those detainer requests. This bill is moving forward, and if a law enforcement officer is found, in violation of not complying, then they could face a Class D felony. So one thing we didn't hear a whole lot in that subcommittee, but one thing we did hear was from the Sheriff's Association, talking about how steep of a penalty that is.
And we did say, I should note on that, we did hear from Representative Holt that he is looking at lowering that penalty in an amendment
when it
comes up on the floor.
For sure. And then another one also moving forward is dealing with driver's licenses. So we kind of saw this issue brought up because of the past election, dealing with citizenship statuses. So this bill would put an identification marker on a driver's license to identify if you are a U.S. citizen or if you are not a U.S. citizen. So essentially, somebody, a poll worker could, check your driver's license and know kind of right away if you're a citizen or not.
And that first bill, Kay, was inspired in no small part by a county sheriff in Iowa, that Winneshiek County sheriff, who had a social media post that effectively said, I don't have the resources or believe it's our duty, and so we won't be cooperating with some of these federal immigration
for the detainers.
Requests, for the detainers specifically.
Which is different than a warrant.
Right.
He referenced warrants. Anyway, let's move on to the Higher Education Committee, a new committee in the Iowa House. Erin, they've had a big workload.
Wasted no time getting to work and putting out all kinds of ideas in the form of bill forms. So, and we've talked about this with some of our guests on this show, but Representative Taylor Collins is the House Republican who's leading this committee that's now just focused on higher education, the regents, the community colleges, and to a lesser degree, even the private colleges. The themes we're hearing are similar to what we've heard in recent years from Republicans and conservatives, trying to make sure diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are eliminated at all the public universities, and even now trying to get at those at the private universities by using the Iowa Tuition Grant, which is a state-funded grant that helps students go to private schools. So even getting at quote-unquote DEI that way, addressing curriculum and requirements. They want to create a school of intellectual freedom at the University of Iowa to make sure that conservative viewpoints are presented just as much as liberal viewpoints on college campuses. Proposed a tuition cap, so a lot of bills flying out of that committee, and as Stephen was talking about before we hit the record button here today, it'll be interesting to see how much of an appetite the Senate Republicans have for this, because all the noise has been on the House side so far.
That's right. There's no equivalent committee on the Senate side, so the Senate doesn't like to pass as many bills as the House, so perhaps we'll see some of these ideas combined, perhaps we'll see some dropped. We'll see how that negotiation process unfolds.
Speaking of the divide between the House and Senate, last year at the end of the session, the House passed a bill to raise legislators' pay. Many of them were sort of undone by the fact that sort of an up-and-coming legislator from the Boone area was not seeking re-election because he said, I have a young family. I can't afford this job. I can't do this. I need to support my family. I'm leaving. And so now we've seen another iteration of this proposal, Stephen.
Yeah, and many people may not know. I mean, the legislature is a part-time job, and so lawmakers make a salary of $25,000 a year. Now they get per diem expenses and they get some other things that increases that a bit, but the point, like you said, is for younger people, people with families, it can be hard to financially make it work. So in the Senate this year, they have a pay increase that would raise it from $25,000 to $45,000 for lawmakers, more for leaders, and it would also raise pay for statewide elected officials. So the governor would go from $130,000 a year to $230,000 a year. The attorney general would go to $210,000. Most of the other statewide elected officials would go to $180,000 from just over $100,000 right now. Now, those numbers may change as they're working on this. This is kind of a tough vote for lawmakers to take, right? To raise their pay. And I should say none of the changes would take effect until 2027. So that puts the 2026 election between now and then.
So technically, they're not raising their own pay. As
correct.
They take this
They're raising the pay of a future governor, a future General Assembly, but it still can be a tough vote to take.
And just real quick for a little bit of extra context on that, because I do kind of find it a fascinating debate, and Stephen's right there. They're considered technically part-time, but that's more because of the length of period of time throughout the year that they work, right? Like they only work January through April, May-ish in a long year. Right. But during session, I mean, they're at the Capitol for full-time job hours effectively. So you can't, it's not easy anyways to hold a separate job while also being at the Capitol during session. So it is a fascinating debate to see unfold. And then as Stephen noted, the political liabilities are clearly very real.
Well, and as you pointed out, I've been covering the legislature for a long time. So I am old enough to remember that they used to have a commission that would recommend salary levels for the statewide elected officials and for legislators, and then present that to legislators, and it was sort of, up or down vote. They got rid of that. And the legislature's salary hasn't been raised in a couple of decades.
Yeah,
right?
and we've heard from one House Republican, who I won't name because it wasn't clear whether he was speaking on the record, but basically said that, that's his opinion is that is a much smarter way to do it rather than asking those folks to take votes on their own salaries.
Yeah, but it has been 20 years since they've raised pay for lawmakers or statewide. So it could be a conversation worth having, but yeah, it's an interesting way to go about it, and we will see what happens.
We've got about 3 minutes left. Quickly, Erin or Stephen, run us through a couple of interesting special elections.
Yeah, that's right. So there have been 2 special elections this year so far. One in the Senate, where a Democrat flipped a seat that was previously held by Chris Knoyer, who is now the lieutenant governor. That was a district that President Trump won by over 20 points, and a Democrat flipped that seat. The other election happened just this week in House District 100 in southeast Iowa, and Republican Blaine Watkins held on to that seat that was left vacant after Representative Martin Graber passed away. The Democrat in that seat came within 3 points of the Republican in a district that Trump won by something like 27 points. So Democrats are feeling good, like they're overperforming their numbers from 2024. And Republicans remind us that special election environments are very different. It's low turnout, and you don't know who's going to be motivated to show up.
Erin, let's talk about something that didn't happen in the Iowa legislature. It happened in South Dakota.
Yeah, so on the pipeline projects and the pipeline bills, and there are some bills, again, flying around the Iowa Capitol, and the Iowa Senate's showing a little more interest this year than they have in the past. Still not clear whether they'll actually pass a bill, but at least are considering them. But and this was interesting. I was actually covering one of those meetings as advocates in the room were monitoring debate in the South Dakota Senate, where they passed a bill, and it did eventually go to the governor and get signed into law, that would ban the use of eminent domain for pipeline projects. Very simple, so pipeline companies couldn't get the government to force landowners to allow their land to be used for pipeline projects. That happened in South Dakota. That's a big hurdle now for those projects, which are also proposed to come through Iowa.
1 minute left. Stephen, 2026 is coming up.
It's here.
We're starting to see people talk like candidates, maybe think they're going to be a candidate.
Yeah, we got the news this week that there are 3 Democrats considering running for Congress in the 3rd District, 3 state lawmakers who are Democrats. And what's striking to me about this conversation is that we're having it in March. 2 years ago, we didn't have a Democratic candidate in the 3rd District until the fall of that year before the election year. So this is a lot earlier in the cycle that people are having these conversations and being serious about this. And that tells me a couple of things. One, the Democrats might feel like the midterm environment could be favorable to them if there's a backlash against Donald Trump. And 2, they need that time to get their infrastructure going and get ready.
Erin?
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see. We've talked about, will that field sort of settle, or will there be a primary for the Democrats in some of these districts, which there's always a debate over whether that's good or bad for the party. We asked State Party Woman Chairwoman Rita Hart about that here a couple weeks ago. So I'll be interested to see how the silent primary, quote unquote, plays out.
Well, you're going to have to be silent now because I'm going to say goodbye to our viewers for this edition of Iowa Press. Thanks for watching. For everyone here at Iowa PBS, have a good day.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa PBS Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
Elite Casino Resorts is a family-run business rooted in Iowa. We believe our employees are part of our family, and we strive to improve their quality of life and the quality of lives within the communities we serve.
Across Iowa, hundreds of neighborhood banks strive to serve their communities, provide jobs, and help local businesses. Iowa banks are proud to back the life you build. Learn more at iowabankers.com.